The tone of this speech is the very thing that makes it work, because a title like Smart Women Follow These 7 Rules could easily be delivered like a corporate seminar, cold and clinical, or like a lecture, finger-wagging and preachy. Instead, the tone here is built to feel like an intimate, one-on-one conversation happening inside a packed room, where every single woman listening feels as though she is the only person being spoken to. It is warm without being soft, and it is firm without being harsh, and that balance is deliberate. The speaker never talks down to the audience, and she never talks above them either. She speaks as someone who has been in the trenches herself, who has failed publicly, loved imperfectly, and rebuilt her life more than once, and who is now turning around to extend a hand to the women coming up behind her. This is achieved through direct address, using you again and again, so that the audience is never a passive crowd being informed, but an active participant being called into the conversation. Notice how often the speech opens with a question rather than a statement, because questions invite reflection, and reflection is where transformation actually begins. A woman sitting in that audience is not simply told that she has shrunk herself for others. She is asked whether she has, and in that asking she is given the dignity of arriving at the truth on her own terms, rather than having it imposed on her. The tone also leans heavily on affirmation, repeating phrases like "you are worthy" and "you have the power," not because repetition is lazy, but because repetition is how truth settles into the body, not just the mind. Many women in that room may have spent years being told the opposite. So the speech does not whisper affirmation once and move on. It returns to it, layering it until it starts to feel less like a compliment and more like a fact. There is also a rhythm to the language, short sentences dropped in after longer ones, like punctuation marks of their own phrases, such as "that's rule number 1," which act almost like a drum beat, giving the audience a moment to exhale and absorb what was just said before the next idea arrives. This pacing is what makes a speech feel alive when spoken aloud, rather than simply read silently off a page, because the pauses are built into the sentence structure itself, not left to chance. Vulnerability runs underneath all of it as well, because the speaker does not present herself as someone above the struggle, looking down and dispensing wisdom from a place of comfort. She presents herself as someone still inside the struggle, alongside everyone else, still learning, still growing, still occasionally failing. This is what makes the tone feel earned rather than performed, because an audience can always sense the difference between someone who is instructing them and someone who is walking beside them. Finally, the tone carries a kind of spiritual undercurrent, not tied to any one religion, but rooted in a broader sense of purpose, destiny, and self-trust, so that by the end, the audience does not simply feel informed, they feel called as though something in them has been stirred awake and given permission to rise. The structure of this speech is built like a journey, not a list, because even though it centers on 7 rules, it never feels like the audience is simply being handed a numbered worksheet. It opens with a hook, a direct question thrown out into the room, designed to create an immediate moment of self-recognition before a single rule has even been introduced. This matters because an audience that has already silently answered, "Yes, that's me," in their own mind is far more open to what comes next than an audience that is simply waiting to be informed. The opening is emotional before it is instructional, and that ordering is intentional, because people remember how a speech made them feel long before they remember what it told them to do. After the hook, there is a bridge, a short personal reflection where the speaker positions herself, not as an expert lecturing from a stage, but as someone who has spent years in close proximity to real women and real stories. This bridge does 2 things at once. It builds trust, and it sets up the central idea of the entire speech, which is the distinction between being smart and being wise. That distinction becomes the spine that everything else hangs on, so that by the time the 7 rules are introduced, the audience already understands why these rules matter, not just what they are. From there, the structure moves into the 7 rules themselves, and each one follows a similar internal shape, even though the language varies. Each rule opens with a clear, almost quotable statement of the principle, something short enough to be remembered and repeated later, like a phrase someone might write down or post online. That statement is then followed by a short expansion, usually 2 or 3 sentences, where the idea is unpacked just enough to be understood without ever becoming a lecture. Some rules include a small story or image, like the garden and the fence, or the napkin with $5 and a dream written on it, because these small pictures give the audience something concrete to hold on to, rather than leaving the idea floating as an abstraction. Each rule then closes with a short, punchy line that restates the rule in a slightly different way, almost like a chorus returning in a song, which reinforces memory through repetition without becoming repetitive in tone. Moving through 7 distinct sections could easily become exhausting for an audience, so the structure varies sentence length and rhythm from rule to rule. Some rules are delivered in quick, clipped sentences, and others are allowed to breathe a little longer, which keeps the energy in the room shifting rather than flattening into a monotone list. After the 7th rule, there is a clear structural turn, marked by the transition line that says there they are, 7 rules, which signals to the audience that the instructional portion of the speech has ended and the emotional closing has begun. This closing section briefly revisits the 7 ideas in a compressed rapid-fire form, almost like a summary a listener could jot down afterward, before the speech lifts into its final, most emotionally charged lines. The very last lines are short and declarative, stripped of any further explanation, because by that point in the structure, explanation is no longer needed, only affirmation. This closing mirrors the opening, returning to direct address and emotional resonance, so the speech ends the way it began, not with information, but with connection, which gives the entire structure a circular, complete feeling, rather than simply stopping once the list runs out. The rhetorical style of this speech relies on a handful of techniques used over and over, deliberately, until they start to feel less like tricks of language and more like the natural voice of someone who has spent a lifetime learning how to move a room. The most obvious of these is repetition, and it shows up in several different forms throughout the speech. There is the repetition of direct address, the constant return to the word you, which keeps every single listener implicated in the message, rather than allowed to sit back as a spectator. There is also the repetition of structural phrases, like that's rule number 1, which functions almost like a refrain in a piece of music, marking the end of one idea and preparing the ear for the next. This kind of repetition is not accidental, because spoken language relies on patterns the ear can anticipate, and once an audience learns the rhythm of a phrase, that phrase becomes a signal, a small landmark they can orient themselves by as the speech moves forward. Rhetorical questions are another central device, and they appear most heavily at the beginning of the speech, where the speaker asks the audience whether they have shrunk themselves, whether they have said they were fine when they were not, whether they have given everything away and kept nothing for themselves. These questions are never actually seeking an answer out loud. They are seeking an answer inside the listener, a private moment of recognition that happens silently in the body before the speech has even made its first point. This technique is powerful because it does the work of persuasion without ever sounding persuasive. The audience is not being told they are exhausted and overextended. They are being asked, and in answering honestly inside their own mind, they persuade themselves. The speech also leans on parallel structure, the repeating of grammatical patterns across a list of ideas, which is most visible in lines like, know your worth, guard your peace, bet on yourself, learn from the falls, trust the whisper, choose your circle, and live fully on your own time. This kind of list, built entirely from short commands, beginning with strong verbs, creates a cumulative momentum, each phrase landing like a beat, until the whole list feels less like separate instructions and more like a single rising wave of energy, carrying the audience toward the ending. Contrast is used throughout as well, smart versus wise, silence as a wall versus silence, as a fence, failure that defines you versus failure that teaches you, an audience that applauds versus a circle that tells the truth. These contrasts work because the human mind understands ideas more clearly when they are placed beside their opposite, and each contrast gives the audience a simple, memorable choice to hold on to long after the speech has ended. There is also a strong use of direct declarative statements, especially near the end, short sentences with no hedging language, no maybe, no perhaps, no in some cases. Lines like "your worth was decided the day you were born, and it is not up for negotiation," are stated as fact, not as opinion, and that certainty is itself a rhetorical choice, because confidence in delivery often creates confidence in belief for the listener. Finally, the closing section uses a technique sometimes called anaphora, the repeating of a similar sentence opening across several lines in a row, stacking short commands one after another without pause, which builds emotional intensity right up until the final line. "Thank you" lands with maximum weight precisely because everything before it has been building toward that release. The themes running through this speech are woven together so tightly that they never feel like separate topics being checked off a list. They feel like different faces of the same underlying message, which is that a woman's life belongs to her, and every choice she makes should flow from that single truth. Self-worth sits at the very center of everything, and it is introduced first because every other theme in the speech is essentially a different application of it. Once a woman believes her worth is not up for negotiation, boundaries become natural because she is no longer explaining herself to earn permission to say no. Once she believes her worth is inherent, rather than earned through performance or approval, financial independence stops being about proving something to anyone else and becomes simply an extension of self-respect, a way of making sure she is never dependent on someone else's goodwill to survive. Boundaries appear as their own theme as well, but they are framed carefully, not as coldness or distance, but as protection, using the image of a fence around a garden rather than a wall meant to keep people out entirely. This distinction matters because many women have been taught that setting limits makes them difficult or unkind, so the speech works to reframe boundaries as an act of care, both for the woman herself and for what she is trying to grow in her life, whether that is a career, a family, a piece of art, or simply her own peace of mind. Intuition is treated as a theme worth trusting, almost like a form of quiet intelligence that exists separately from logic, something that has been speaking all along, long before circumstances forced a woman to listen. The speech suggests that so much unnecessary suffering comes not from a lack of warning, but from ignoring the warning when it was small and easy to dismiss, and that wisdom often looks like learning to take that inner voice seriously before life has to raise its volume through crisis or heartbreak. Growth through failure is another major thread, and it is handled without shame, treating failure not as evidence of inadequacy, but as raw material, something to be studied rather than hidden. This theme resists the cultural instinct to only celebrate the finished, polished version of success, and instead insists that the mess in between is not something to apologize for. It is the actual process by which strength gets built. Financial and emotional independence run underneath several of the rules without ever being stated as their own separate rule, showing up instead in the language of investing in oneself first, funding one's own dreams before funding anyone else's, and refusing to wait on someone else's timeline for love, success, or healing. This theme speaks to a very specific kind of freedom, the freedom that comes from not needing anyone's permission or financial support to build a life that feels whole. Community also threads through the speech, but it is a very particular kind of community being described, not a wide audience of admirers, but a small, trusted circle capable of telling the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. This theme acknowledges that no woman rises entirely alone, while still protecting the idea that not everyone deserves access to that inner circle, that discernment about who gets close is itself a form of self-respect. Finally, living with intention ties every other theme together at the end, the idea that time is not meant to be measured against anyone else's calendar, that a woman's becoming does not follow a fixed schedule, and that the ultimate goal is not to check boxes in the right order, but to move through life awake, deliberate, and fully in charge of her own unfolding story. The delivery notes for this speech matter just as much as the words themselves, because a piece written with this much rhythm and repetition is meant to live in the air, spoken aloud in a room full of people, not read silently off a page, where all of its pacing and breath would simply disappear. The very first line, "Good evening everybody," should be delivered slowly, almost too slowly, because the opening moments of any speech set the pace for everything that follows, and rushing the greeting signals nervousness rather than authority. A speaker should let that first line land, let the room settle, and only then move into the opening question, because that question needs space around it to actually work as a rhetorical device rather than just another sentence. The early rhetorical questions, how many of you have shrunk yourselves? How many of you have said you were fine when you were not, should be delivered with real pauses between them, not rushed together as a single breath. Each question deserves a beat of silence afterward, long enough for the speaker to actually look out at the audience, because those pauses are what allow individual listeners to privately answer inside themselves. If those questions are read too quickly, they lose their power and start to sound rhetorical in the dismissive sense, like empty phrasing rather than genuine invitation. The phrase, I see those hands, I see you, should be delivered almost conversationally, dropping out of the more formal rhythm of the speech for a moment. Because this is the point where the speaker breaks the fourth wall slightly and acknowledges the room as a living, responding audience, rather than a passive crowd. This kind of small aside works best when it sounds unscripted, even though it is written into the speech, and a skilled speaker will let a small smile or a slight laugh live inside that line. Each of the 7 rules should be delivered with a shift in energy at the very start, a slight lift in volume, or a change in pace, because this signals to the audience that a new idea is beginning, functioning almost like a spoken paragraph break. The short, punchy lines that close each rule section, like that's rule number 1, should be delivered with a slight downward inflection, almost like a period being placed at the end of a spoken sentence, giving the audience a clear sense of completion before the next rule begins. The stories and images inside the rules, the garden and the fence, the napkin with $5 written on it, should be delivered a little more gently and a little more slowly than the surrounding lines, because these moments are meant to feel intimate, almost like the speaker is leaning in slightly, lowering her volume rather than raising it, which paradoxically draws an audience in more effectively than volume ever. As the speech approaches its closing section, there they are, 7 rules. The pace should begin to quicken slightly, building momentum the way a piece of music builds toward its final movement. The rapid list near the end, know your worth, guard your peace, bet on yourself, should be delivered almost breathlessly, each phrase stacked closely on top of the last with very little pause, allowing the energy to rise continuously, rather than resetting between each item. The final lines, the direct address, about not being put on this earth to be small, should slow back down again, deliberately, almost dropping to a near whisper, before rising back up in volume on the very last line. Thank you, which should be delivered simply without embellishment, allowing the emotional weight built over the entire speech to carry that final moment rather than any vocal trick. In the end, this speech works because it never asks its audience to simply admire it. It asks them to recognize themselves inside it, and that is the quiet engine driving every choice made throughout the piece, from its opening question to its final thank you. The tone builds intimacy so that 7 rules feel less like instructions and more like truths already living somewhere inside each listener, waiting to be named out loud. The structure carries that intimacy forward in a shape the ear can follow without effort, opening with connection, moving through 7 distinct movements that each rise and settle in turn, then closing in a way that mirrors how it began, giving the whole speech a sense of coming full circle rather than simply running out of things to say. The rhetorical style, built on repetition, contrast, direct address, and rising rhythm, is what turns simple statements into lines an audience carries out of the room with them, remembered not because they were clever, but because they were felt. The themes beneath all of it, worth, boundaries, intuition, failure, independence, community, and intention, all point back to a single idea, that a woman's life is hers to define on her own terms, at her own pace, according to her own truth. And the delivery, the pauses, the shifts in volume, the moments of stillness before the moments of rising energy is what allows all of that meaning to actually land in real time, in a real room, in real bodies listening. Taken together, none of these elements function as separate techniques stacked on top of each other. They function as one unified act of persuasion, built entirely on empathy rather than pressure, on recognition rather than instruction, so that by the final line, the audience is not simply told they are worthy, they already believe it, because the entire speech was built from its very first word to help them arrive